Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Matthew McMillan. I'm the Los Angeles Regional Event Coordinator on behalf of the Association of Marshall Scholars. I'm a 2014 scholar, and I studied philosophy, mathematics, and physics during my Marshall years in the UK. I'm very happy to welcome all of you to this panel about big tech, media, and our digital social identities. I'd like to thank especially our panelists and moderator for taking the time to share their insights with us today. I'm excited about the interesting and diverse range of perspectives that I'm confident they'll provide in this topic. First, though, a little background about the Association of Marshall Scholars. The AMS is comprised of about 2,000 Marshall Scholar members and works to strengthen US-UK ties and the Marshall Scholarship itself. Historically, the Transatlantic Alliance has served as a linchpin of liberal democracy and global peace. The Marshall Scholarship has been a valuable thread of this relationship, and it has strengthened international collaboration and advancements in nearly every discipline of human endeavor. The AMS hosts monthly events, both virtual and in person, for current scholars and alumni around the world. More information about upcoming events will appear on our website, and you'll be able to view a recording of this webinar and other past events on the AMS YouTube channel as well. Links to both of these can be found in your chat box as soon as I paste them into there. Let me do that right now. The top one is to the AMS page and then the YouTube page, channel. Let me say a few words of introduction about our speakers for today. We have Teddy Collins. He was a research scientist at DeepMind in London, a research affiliate at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, and a fellow at Georgetown Center for the Study of Emerging Technology. At DeepMind, he led the meta research team that used machine learning to investigate trends in AI research and improve managerial and strategic decision-making within the company. He also conducts research on the geopolitics of artificial intelligence and the implications of AI for governance systems. Anna Feuer is the Julian Steward Chair of Social Sciences at Deep Springs College in Eastern California. She holds a PhD in political science from Yale University, and her research focuses on counterinsurgency, military technology, and cultural and environmental history. Her current book project traces the historical development of geospatial technologies used to make battlefields legible in 20th century counterinsurgency campaigns. John Askonas is an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He holds an MPhil and DPhil from Oxford and works in the connections between the Republican tradition, technology, and national security, and is currently writing a collection of essays on the connection between artificial intelligence research and authoritarian surveillance. He is also working on a book examining post-war organizational forgetting processes in militaries. Our moderator for today, Michael Lee, is the founder and president of the Data Incubator, which is a data science training and placement firm. Before that, he had monetization data science at Foursquare and has worked at Google, Andreessen Horowitz, JP Morgan, and D.E. Shaw. He's a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, Wired, Harvard Business Review, the MIT Sloan Management Review, and some other journals. And now, without any further delay, I'd like to hand over to Michael Lee to start our conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for joining us. I know this is sort of a Friday afternoon, and you may be in a place with nicer weather than DC. And if you are, you may be trying to take advantage of that. So if you're here despite your better options, we're very grateful. But look, this obviously the world of AI, the world of technology is an incredibly pressing world. You only have to look at the latest headlines to see this. And we have these wonderful distinguished panelists here. So without further ado, I'd love to just jump into this conversation. And I think a lot of our conversation revolves around ethics and the kind of human perspective of AI and modern technology. So to kick things off, I'd love to know what's sort of one favorite application around AI and big data that you think is sort of maybe a good thing that these technologies are doing, and what is one kind of specific concern you have, or maybe specific tool that you're afraid of that you think might be harmful to society? Shall we start with Anna?
Sure. I have to say, One of my favorite tools is targeted ads.
On the,
I
is that
like
the positive
them.
or that's the negative?
That's a positive. I mean, in the sense that I have found many brands that I like through targeted ads. You know, being home during the pandemic means that I haven't been able to shop in person. And so, you know, I haven't walked into a physical bookstore in a year and a half. And I've been kind of amazed at how Amazon is able to predict the books that I like to read. And there is a real pleasure in the experience of feeling as though Amazon and other sites are able to know me in some way and to respond to my preferences. So I enjoy, I mean, I'm interpreting this question in a particular way, but I enjoy the experience of a targeted ad. But of course, you know, my enjoyment.
As a person who targeted ads previously, I'm like super excited that somebody actually liked what I did. Usually I just get like kind of stares, you know.
Yeah. Well, but I say that knowing though that you know, my enjoyment of targeted ads is a problem, I think, right? In the sense that, you know, targeted ads are so convenient, right? I like the experience of feeling as though targeted ads just respond to, you know, they see into my heart and they respond to my desires, and they're so convenient. And I think they have habituated me in a certain sense to prioritizing convenience over other priorities like privacy or like, you know, my concern for the sustainability of local bookstores or other kinds of local businesses. So I like them, you know, to answer the question truthfully, that is the kind of application that I enjoy. In terms of an application that I'm concerned about, you know, my interest is in military technology, and there's much to say about that, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later in the conversation. But something that I've been thinking about recently, that in a way I can only speak about as a layperson, but I think is quite interesting, is emotion AI or empathetic AI that, in my understanding, is designed to classify and interpret facial expressions, body language, gestures, measure levels of oxytocin, you know, all kinds of external indicators of internal emotional states. And I think there are a lot of sort of obvious questions about this technology. Is it just pseudoscience? You know, what kind of biases would be entailed in, you know, in trying to infer someone's emotion from their outer expression? But I guess, you know, I think a kind of interesting implication that is one that I'm worried about is I'm concerned about the boomerang effect that such technology might have. In the same way, I think that, you know, the Facebook like button or the thumbs up, thumbs down buttons that we get from YouTube, you know, perhaps we can say that the terms that these digital companies have given to us have actually, you know, sort of shaped us to understand our own preferences in binary terms of likes and dislikes. You know, I wonder if the increased use of emotion AI might sort of boomerang back to us, such that our own emotional awareness then is understood in terms provided for us by, you know, our employers or the corporations that we interact with online. So yeah, that's something that I'm interested in thinking about the implications of.
Those are very good points. John, you want to go next?
Sure. I think the advances we've made in visual classification AI are really revolutionary and really important. I mean, everything from on the personal level, it's unbelievable that I can walk in with my iPhone and use the Dropbox app to digitize and you know, generate text from archival documents, it makes it's revolutionary for any academic work that touches history. To on the very big scale, you know, I think as we encounter climate change, it's really important that we have better than ever ways of measuring and understanding desertification and forest growth and all these other things that have been enabled by visual classification improvements. On the kind of danger side, at least in kind of under acknowledged danger, I'm worried about what it means to be human in a world of 90% good AI cultural production and just the level of noise that can be produced. You know, our friends at DeepMind were able to create I think they call it Twatter, a kind of artificially generated Twitter that was totally persuasive. You wouldn't be able to tell, you know, it passes the Turing test. I mean, the thing that has happened that we have not fully grappled with is that we have passed the Turing test, not in the sense of one, you know, a one-on-one interview with an AI being convincing, but there's enough noise out there now that non-human cultural production easily hides amidst the noise. And my concern isn't so much about misinformation, disinformation, or whatever. We could talk about that. But what does it mean to develop skill and culture, to develop music, to develop art, to develop writing, when, especially when you're beginning, when you're not very good, when a computer can do it 90% better than 90% of humans, right? And what does it do to our ability to reach the kind of ascendant heights of transcendent human art, transcendent reflection of what it means to be human, in a world where until you reach that level of true excellence, you're competing against infinite automation. So that's something that I think we haven't really grappled with yet.
Good points. Thank you, John. Teddy, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess on the negative end, I think there are some things that are like pretty obviously bad that maybe are like so obvious that it's not even worth getting into. But I think like there's a lot of stuff in the militarization direction that's just like clearly like net harmful to society. But maybe what I'd call out is I think that there is a bigger category of stuff that isn't necessarily an inherently malicious use, but if done in a less than totally informed way, leads to all kinds of problems. I think that like one of the like hallmarks of machine learning is that because you are not telling it explicitly what to do, it can end up learning to do things that you did not foresee. And sometimes that's great, and you get all of this, you know, these cool, creative. Yeah, at DeepMind, we would often talk about this one particular move in this Go game that AlphaGo, which is this program that DeepMind created that plays Go, that AlphaGo made. That was, you know, people just like absolutely lost it over this move. It was totally mind blowing. A woman got a tattoo of this move, and so that's great. But then also, you know, the same thing means that you can be, let's say, a very good person, but you can create something that you're trying to use to do a good thing, and it can go off the rails in all sorts of ways. There are really well documented examples of racial bias, of privacy issues, and I think that we're in a position now where the tooling necessary to train machine learning models has become really accessible, which is mostly very good, but that capability has far outpaced the sort of ease of using the tools that are under development and, you know, hopefully will become even easier to use to foolproof these systems. So, you know, how can you, there's this open source community that I'm involved with, OpenMind, that does some really cool work around trying to develop libraries so that you can easily train and run models in a privacy preserving way. There's lots of interesting stuff in the fairness, accountability, transparency, and bias space, also trying to develop like robust and easily used test suites for those things. So yeah, I guess what I'd call out is not like the end goal of a lot of uses, but the fact that it's just really easy for things to go off the rails. And at the most dystopian end, this is like, you know, going back to Asimov, you get all of these issues with value alignment where you try to get something to do something useful, and it just ends up like killing all of humanity and you know, replacing everyone with paperclips. So that's, I guess, like the big category that I call out as being harmful. And then on the positive side, I would again say there are some things that are obviously really good. Lots of really, really cool science research. DeepMind has for a long time focused on science, and just earlier this week announced the creation of a new sort of subsidiary alphabet company that will apply some of DeepMind's breakthroughs, including in protein folding, to continued sort of like scientific research. But the thing that maybe I would focus on is not like the obviously good things, but similarly the work being done to like develop the tools necessary to build AI more responsibly. I think there's like a lot of cool stuff in that direction. And in particular, I think there's lots of cool stuff in terms of how can you use machine learning to build better systems for distributed decision making.
Cool, absolutely. Well, one of the things we've been blessed to have today are two world-class experts when it comes to sort of the military and technology. And we just exited the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. What role did AI play in those battlefields? John, do you want to start?
Sure. I think the extent to which machine learning and AI were critical is really very well poorly understood outside of very technical communities. Beginning really in Iraq. As folks probably remember, the Iraqi insurgency had a kind of asymmetric strategy to inflicting cost on the states, right? So you had insurgents who were not, you know, putting on uniforms and going to war, right? They were hiding amidst the population. They were building bombs. They were sniping at soldiers. And the US government, through a set of organizations, including the IED task force, and then also mobilizing a number of R&D organizations, DARPA and others, a little more obscure, the CCSDO, mobilized unbelievable resources to fight back against this any way that they could, right? And that as part of that, there were substantial investments made in network intelligence analysis and social network analysis, tools to make it easier for intelligence analysts to find connections between people. There were major investments in biometrics, and actually the creation of the world's largest, expeditionary biometric data sets ever. Literally, tens of millions of Iraqi and Afghani, primarily males, in these databases of cornea iris scans and retina scans and fingerprints. Not so much DNA, I don't believe, although it's DNA too when they could collect it. And maybe most importantly, the creation of new surveillance technologies and ways of knitting together, of early uses of big data, knitting together cell phone data and wide area persistent surveillance data. That's a fancy term that people should be more aware of, but the military pushed the envelope on the fidelity of surveillance captured, not even from drones, or actually more commonly from piloted aircraft like Cessna, flying over cities like Baghdad with these cameras, hyper detailed cameras. You could watch the entire city from one camera, basically. And that actually had a number of implications, right? It was capturing so much data that in the early years of the war in 2005, analysts were actually boarding flights back from Baghdad to Langley or to Fort Meade with multi-terabyte hard drives of data. They didn't have the latency to actually move the data, right? In order to analyze this data, it was far more data than individual analysts could actually use. And so a number of the foundational breakthroughs in visual classification technology came out of US military investments in the early 2000s to make use of this data, right? And that kind of was one of the factors that led to some of these big breakthroughs in commercial AI uses in the 2010s. So that technology is now with us. And that technology was used to find insurgents, to find IED makers, to target airstrikes. And so even before you get to questions about automation, right, the US intelligence operation runs on machine learning today. Both visual classification, network detection, and kind of noise analysis, and target profile building is all enhanced by machine learning.
Wow, that's some really deep stuff. Anna, Teddy, any other comments?
Yeah, I think what John has described is very interesting and very concerning in many ways. I mean, I think what's interesting to me about what has happened in Afghanistan is, the United States has had just this tremendous technological power, tremendous technological capacity, at its fingertips, and yet we've seen this really terrible outcome in Afghanistan. One, many people have made the connection to the Vietnam War. And in both cases, I think the question is raised as to how did, this very highly capitalized, the highest tech, most sophisticated military in the history of the world, right? Why wasn't it able to achieve its objectives against a force like the Taliban, an extremely, by comparison, an extremely low tech force like the Taliban? And I'm interested in thinking through the ways in which US military technological supremacy actually contributes to the problems that it encountered in Afghanistan. And I think one of the ways, or the way that I'm inclined to think about it, is a very high-tech military like the US has a tendency to substitute or to answer what are truly political questions, what are actually political questions, with technical answers or technical solutions. And it has had that tendency since the Vietnam War, if not before, and it doesn't seem like it's on the way to losing or correcting that tendency. And as John was explaining, in the context of a counterinsurgency environment, that's really an information war to the extent that counterinsurgents are seeking to gain information that will help them distinguish between insurgents and civilians in an environment dominated by civilians. And developing highly enhanced AI and other kinds of tools to track combatants or surveil combatants 24 hours a day, doesn't necessarily actually get at answering the political questions, which is how do you distinguish between a combatant and a civilian? What constitutes an appropriate target in this context? And I think that substitution of is actually political. I mean, in a way understandable because that's what the military is equipped and set up to do. But I think particularly in a counterinsurgency or asymmetric warfare context where the challenges that have faced the United States are very much about understanding the political and cultural context of the environment in which the military is fighting, we've seen over and over again that a software upgrade is not really the answer to those kinds of problems or those kinds of questions.
And so it sounds like this is a lot like The Best and the Brightest, right? Which is Halbert Stam's famous book about Vietnam. Is there something structural that sort of prevents us from learning this lesson? Anna?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, John, I think as you've described, some of your work is on why lessons are not able to be learned. So you might want to take that first. But on the whole, I guess what I would say, I mean, I guess part of my answer is that I think actually answering the political questions that I've described, how do we distinguish between a combatant and a civilian in these contexts, is actually an extremely hard question. It's not a question that is really a tractable question. And the military in Afghanistan tried a number of ways to answer that question, including putting humans on the ground, putting boots on the ground, you know, hiring anthropology graduate students as part of what was known as human terrain teams to get on the ground and sort of map out what was known as the human terrain of Afghanistan, sort of create a cultural profile of the country. And cycling people in and out in very short tours actually did not produce very useful data. And the military has really relied on technology to make the Afghan population, to make the Afghan life legible. And I guess I'm inclined to think that efforts at legibility that are mediated through technology always sort of keep the US military at arm's length from the population or the territory that they're trying to learn about. And actually learning about it, I mean, I think would require just a much more massive investment and much more humans on the ground than the military is really willing to, it's just a cost that the military probably isn't willing to pay.
Anyone else? Teddy, John?
Yeah, I'll speak very briefly to that. I think there's a number of things in play. One is, as Anna said, there's the U.S. has a capital-intensive approach to warfare, which is not unique to it. And you know, when you value when the political cost of individual casualties is relatively high, there's a willingness to invest more in hardware and in capital technology to mitigate that, right? So the fact the U.S. spent literally tens of billions of dollars fighting the IED threat. You know, if you do look at it, dollars per soldier, we're talking about, you know, $10 million per soldier casualty, if you wanted to measure it that way, something like that. So we're willing to spend enormous amounts of money to mitigate some of those political costs. That's like a very narrow response. I think on the bigger level, as Anna was sort of gesturing towards, is the alternative to trying to find these technological solutions would be to treat these conflicts seriously as political conflicts that require compromise, and where what America can achieve is limited by American ability and by American sort of will to fight. And it's been easy to substitute technological improvement for answering those difficult questions. You know, and I do think, at least since the Second World War, technology has been seen as a kind of asymmetric advantage. You know, everyone remembers kind of the atomic bomb, but a whole host of military technologies, including all these early computing technologies, came out of the Second World War efforts. So, you know, we have this infrastructure that solves, we have a technology development infrastructure that solves military problems of all varieties. And when we encounter problems that are in fact deep-seated political problems, deep-seated cultural problems, the military throws the same infrastructure at those sets of problems. So I think this kind of deep operational code organizational dimension as well, which ties back into the political dimension of the relationship between the military and civilian leaders.
Got it. And moving from kind of the past to the future, how do you see AI or technology impacting the battlefield of tomorrow?
I'll go first this time, I guess. I mean, it's going to be huge, right? The U.S. is making the most significant modernization investments since at least the 1980s right now. And it's not being talked about very much outside of kind of more focused circles, right? Some of those are, obvious, like machine learning, investing in AI. Some of them might be less obvious to people. The military is investing a tremendous amount in spaceless capability because there's a recognition that to do autonomy and to do, to incorporate machine learning and the rapid command and control and autonomous weapons that it allows requires backhaul of space communications, and low Earth orbit satellites are going to be a very difficult to counter way to do that, right? The Army is investing billions in simulation technology, and this is going to be like, everyone's kind of making fun of Mark Zuckerberg right now by the metaverse, right? But I think he's just ahead of the curve. Right now, the Army is huge contracts with Microsoft, and I think it will have contracts with other providers, maybe even including Meta now, I guess, to develop immersive simulation systems that allow for certain kinds of training that are otherwise very difficult, right? And the technology has come a long way, and I think that this is actually going to take this time. But then those investments, those tens of millions of dollars of investments, will have all kinds of commercial spin-offs and implications, right? So I think it isn't just Facebook that is investing in, or Meta that's investing in this kind of technology. And then, of course, there's automation, and we can talk about that more. But there's the threshold of automation is we're fielding more and more kinds of autonomous weapons, and while we are preserving human on the loop systems, like we won't allow fully autonomous weapons. That's almost a distinction without a difference when every element of the kill chain is automated except for a human can kind of have a veto at the last minute if they wanted.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add there, but I mean, I'm interested in the use of augmented reality systems on the battlefield. I mean, this is what the recent Microsoft contract is dealing with, the creation of these augmented reality headsets to be worn by members of the Army. And my understanding, though, I think the details of what they will actually entail are a little bit scarce from what I can tell. But I think, what they're going to be doing is to improve soldiers' situational awareness on the battlefield, help them navigate unknown terrain with the use of GPS, help them see through fog and various kinds of weather obstacles, and also, do what I've been talking about before, which is to better identify targets or distinguish between combatants and civilians. And I'm interested in this technology in particular, just because I think we look at a number of historical cases to say that insurgents often have a kind of advantage in the fact that they actually have a kind of intimate and embodied experience of the battlefield, whether we're talking about rural or urban terrain. And I think we can look at augmented reality as an effort to kind of fill that gap, right? To compensate for the fact that the United States is entering foreign theaters just without that same kind of intimate and local knowledge. And my prediction would be that there will sort of inevitably be these irreducible blind spots in things like augmented reality headsets. And when it comes to counterinsurgency in particular, I would think that adaptive insurgents would be able to make their way into those blind spots or take advantage of them. Yeah, that's all.
I do think, just to respond briefly, it's, while the technology isn't being built for its use in counterinsurgency, because that's sort of passe in military thinking right now, it has some very interesting applications. One of the explicit goals of this headset is also to be able to do a translation, automatic translation, and the lack of translators really held back. Well, on the one hand, the lack of translators held back U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the other hand, translators were often the only people with a clue about the local culture, the local context, and they provided that. And this would actually remove them from the battlefield. So I think it has all kinds of second-order effects. One thing we haven't talked about very much yet, one danger about military technology development is the battlefield is a space where anything goes as long as it's operational, within kind of very minimal ethical frameworks. As long as it's operational utility, you can do it, you can build it, right? And so it creates a space where the military can build a kind of surveillance system that would be absolutely unacceptable in the United States. But these technologies, once they exist, you can't just put them back in the bottle, right? Like a lot of the technologies that are going to private sector surveillance efforts in the United States, a lot of them were built in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of the technology that's gone into the genocide in Xinjiang was built by U.S. military research. And so I do think there is a danger of allowing military technology development in a kind of unfettered way, a danger to civic society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I think maybe
Go
just
ahead.
something to add to that, which is totally correct, is also that I think the dangers here with AI are maybe bigger than with your typical dual use technology, because it is by its nature very general. And so it's not just a problem of like you develop a surveillance tool in one setting and it's like, oh, what a shocker, like this surveillance tool is being used in all these places we don't need to be used. But also it can be the case that you develop something that, the scientists who are working on it might have had no clue that this could be used for surveillance purposes. But it turns out that the same underlying capabilities can easily generalize to that. This is, I think, a debate that often is had in at AI labs, is like, how foreseeable is this stuff, and how much responsibility do the people who are doing the research and development have for like the ways these things are used down the line? And obviously, like, there's some level of fog, but I think that increasingly the scientific community is really trying to think proactively about how to predict those things. But it's very, very difficult, because these things are indeed like sort of by their nature general purpose, and only becoming increasingly so. And so it becomes much more difficult to predict how these things will be used, which has all kinds of interesting ethical implications.
But if I ask you a question, Teddy, I mean, if it works and if it's profitable, what are the odds that an ethical question actually stops a company from building the technology?
I think it depends a lot on the company. I mean, I can speak to the fact that, like at DeepMind, and for the record, for anyone watching this, I left DeepMind recently, so this isn't something I'm legally obligated to say or whatever. But DeepMind actually has a very good internal process for like DeepMind hires ethicists, and there is an internal review process that any research has to go through before it's greenlit, in which people have spent a lot of time trying to develop frameworks to assess these sorts of things. But that's definitely not a guarantee across like all labs. I think there is a huge range, and obviously something only needs to be built once in one place. One potential downside of the mostly positive norms of openness in the relatively academic AI community is that things get published and things get open sourced, and that has lots of benefits. But it also means that things, harmful things, proliferate as well as good ones quite rapidly. And so, yeah, I cannot speak to labs other than DeepMind. I find it encouraging that I think a lot of the most prominent people in the space have been very vocal, and so DeepMind leadership has said that, but like plenty of other academics who are like very well regarded, the heads of other labs, it now seems to be sort of an unwritten rule that any company that's doing AI research has to have a set of AI ethical principles. I think there's huge variance in terms of how binding those are, and how seriously they're taken internally. And so yeah, I think things are moving in the right direction, but there are still loads of ways that they can go wrong. I guess that's kind of like a vague cop out of a statement, but that would be my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to illustrate sort of this example, what John and Teddy were talking about, there's sort of this famous story of ClearView AI, which is kind of a technology company that went and took a bunch of profile pictures of people from, I think it was Facebook and the different sort of social media networks, and then they sort of were able to associate a face with an identity, and then they could go around hunting for people on surveillance cameras, I think is their application. But it's sort of sold to law enforcement as a way of saying like, oh, you want to look for John Smith? Oh, look, here's John Smith. We just found him and he's at this block, right? And it's sort of a very Orwellian application. And I think kind of it gets to what John was saying, that like once the technology is out there, you can't stop people. And as to Teddy's point, even if one company isn't willing to do it, right? Because like Facebook had the data, but they weren't really interested in using this application. But somebody else might, and so it sort of becomes a free for all. And we have to think. I think we just have to think more carefully about how do we as a society try to put boundaries on this and say what are and aren't viable. Because in a free market, for better or for worse, everything that can get paid, that will get a buyer, will get built. Right.
If I could just add something to that, I wonder also, something I'm interested in, the ways in which AI just transforms the terms of the ethical questions that might be relevant. Thinking about military applications, the military always insists that humans will stay in the loop when it comes to making decisions about the use of lethal force. But I think that even the humans who are in the loop are going to be responding to the kinds of ethical questions that are most salient within that loop and that are in some ways dictated by the machines themselves. So the example I have in mind here is, or I guess what I'd say is that I think AI has a tendency to lead us toward a stricter utilitarian calculus when it comes to ethical decision-making rather than a deontological consideration. I think, the sort of maybe an obvious example, and maybe this is sort of old news, but, MIT created that moral machine project, which was an effort to crowdsource ethical decisions that would need to be made by driverless cars. It was kind of a version of the trolley problem where, the driverless car will crash into an obstacle and kill its passenger, or it'll swerve and kill the pedestrian. And the moral machine project asked its users, okay, so the car, gets in an accident and kills its driver, who's a doctor, or it swerves and kills the pedestrian, who's a pregnant woman. And you're supposed to sort of make that choice, right? Which is horrifying in a number of ways. But I think what's interesting about it is that it reveals how AI lends itself to strictly utilitarian decision-making, because all it can really do is approach problems in terms of resource allocation. And my concern is that AI then will narrow our moral imaginations in quite a severe way, or seem to actually obviate the need for any moral imagination. And so even though we have ethicists who are playing significant roles in these companies, my question is, how can we ensure that the ethicists aren't stopped in terms that are themselves dictated by the technology?
I guess I push back on that a little bit. I actually think there's like a really, I think in some ways, definitely it's the case that thinking about these things in some lenses, and those lenses maybe are the types of lenses that lots of people who work in AI tend to bring, like lend themselves to utilitarianism. But it's definitely not the case that like the only value functions that like machine learning agents can learn are utilitarian ones. And there's some very cool research being done both on the technical side by people in the safety community about how you can get agents to learn like pretty diverse, pluralistic human values. And there's also interesting work on the philosophy side, including by some of my former colleagues at DeepMind, like a guy, Yasin Gabriel, looking specifically at utilitarian discourse has for so long defined a lot of the frameworks that people have brought to AI. So this whole existential risk community, which is an offshoot of the effective altruists, and they tend to think about things in a very utilitarian way. But like that doesn't need to be the defining view for the community, and it is not like it's not like there is some technical limitation whereby like AI systems can only make utilitarian decisions.
Yeah, I was gonna say we absolutely do need to audit all AI companies to see how many ethicists are Kantians or utilitarians versus virtue ethicists. It's very important.
You might have its share of non-utilitarians there, right?
Yeah, good.
I guess one footnote I should say there is that it's definitely the case that there are some connections to, so like reinforcement learning, which is like what was one of the most on the rise types of machine learning research, in a sense has an objective that like you could define as utilitarian. You're trying to optimize some scalar reward, but what you bake into that can encompass all kinds of different things. And there are all kinds of cool research also on how you can put on side constraints and things like that. And so there are, I don't mean to say that there are not connections there, there definitely are, but I don't think that like we're doomed only to having these sort of like monist utilitarian systems.
So as we're talking more about the business world and the kind of connection between the business world and technology, I'd love to sort of talk a little bit about big tech and leadership, right? What do you think is the role that big tech plays? What the role that the leadership of big tech plays in how AI will proceed going forward? Anyone want to start?
Well, I did write an article about tech utopia and tyranny, so I guess I'm on the hook for this one a little bit. I mean, I think the vision for, especially our largest tech companies are really founder driven in a way that was not always, the case for technology development. And there's such a green field around AI development that there's a lot of the assumptions and beliefs and goals that people building it matter a lot, as I think Teddy has spoken to. I do think it matters that we have this kind of, it's based on utilitarianism, I guess, but it's beyond that. We have this kind of hedonic assumption where anything that can meet a human desire, can detect and meet a human desire faster, quicker, better, cheaper, is good. We should just do that, right? And this is leading us to, as much as I love targeted ads, and as much as targeted ads are in some ways an improvement over other kinds of ads, there are secondary effects, right? So, for example, targeted ads or mass ads, when you saw Coca-Cola billboards on the highway, wherever, as silly as that is, that creates a mass audience. A national ad campaign helps create a nation, right? A group of people with shared experiences. To the extent that we have where everyone is fed the most personalized item, we actually do lose a tangible sense of kind of common identity. I don't think it's a coincidence that the rise of recommendation engines and targeted ads is occurring at the same time as there's been this massive fragmentation in American public identity, this massive change in how people understand their own identities, this move towards much more hyper individualized notions of identity. Those are the same thing, essentially. So I think that paradigm has a lot of implications for our political life that need to be explored. The other thing I would say is that the folks at big tech companies don't necessarily have a huge influence over the kinds of machine learning that get built, or the machine learning algorithms, machine learning research. Not that they do have an influence, but there are other actors and national security actors, other nations, other industrial university actors, but they have unbelievable influence over the kinds of data that get collected, right? There's a certain size and scale of data collection that requires running the rails of massively scaled networks. And one thing that we have been very bad as a society about is thinking seriously about the secondary social and political implications of the kinds of data that are collected, how that data is used. And that is something that is in the control of a very small number of actors.
Yeah. I think Teddy, Anna.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess I would say that, thinking about Mark Zuckerberg, who obviously has been in the news a lot recently, thinking about Mark Zuckerberg makes me sort of think that there is a real limit to the control that big tech leaders have over their products. And I mean, this is more obvious in the case of social media than it is in the case of AI. But in the case of Facebook in particular, Mark Zuckerberg has given us a million answers to the question of what is Facebook for, what is Facebook about, right? Like, it's to connect people, it's to, enhance our participation in democracy, it's to create a more transparent society, whatever. But I think it's kind of obvious that Mark Zuckerberg doesn't really know what Facebook is for or what it's about, because Facebook has sort of taken on this dynamic life of its own, and the phenomena that have emerged, that is taking place on Facebook, that Facebook is desperately, or maybe not desperately, but is trying very much to respond to. The kinds of things that we're seeing happening in India and Myanmar, the kinds of misinformation campaigns that we've seen here in the United States. I think that people like Zuckerberg are always going to be playing catch up to those phenomena because they are, in an important and fundamental way, emergent phenomena, right? I mean, we should think about social media in particular as a platform, and tech leaders are not actually totally in control about what happens on that platform. And I guess I would say that I'm interested in the real limitations that tech leaders are facing in actually trying to create platforms or products that fully conform to their image or their intention. These are technologies that in many ways, I think, take on dynamics that are beyond their control.
And do you think that the limitation that's imposed on them is technical, or do you think it's sort of economic? That is, they could try to shut down some of these more viral groups that are, say, spreading misinformation about COVID or the elections, but those groups get a lot of engagement and are responsible for a lot of ads, and they don't want to disappoint shareholders this quarter.
Yeah, and I think certainly the economic incentives that are at play. I mean, to really address the misinformation campaigns would mean restructuring the whole way in which Facebook platforms and the Facebook feed works. I'm really not an expert on the technical side at all, so Teddy or John, you might be able to come in and help me out here. But I would think that certainly the economic incentives are such that whatever interventions a company like Facebook is likely to carry out are only going to be interventions that do not impose, severe costs. And we've already really seen that from Facebook, right? I mean, we know that Facebook knows, of course, that their content has been very harmful for teenage girls, for instance. And one sort of obvious solution to that is to create an age limit for Facebook. And I think it's very unlikely that Facebook is going to do that. There's just economic incentives against it. But the other thing I'd say, maybe this is something more like a metaphysical claim, but I do think that, group phenomena are just not inherently predictable. And so tech leaders are unlikely to be able to predict and thereby manipulate group phenomena in advance. We won't really know what that phenomena is until it happens. And then Facebook is going to have to retroactively figure out what to do about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would completely second basically everything Anna said. And I guess I would I'd layer on top of that I think it's easier to talk about like these specific personalities, but I think that indeed like the underlying thing is structural. And if you are running a publicly traded company, you have certain obligations, and even if the people who were running them were like sort of omniscient saints, you would still have kind of severe constraints. And in many settings, that's like the type of optimization that those entities do is really good. And there are types of competition that lead to great research and great products. But I think that when we think about in the most sort of techno-utopian vision, what are all of the things that we as a society would like AI to provide? I think it would be an almost impossible coincidence to say that like those things will happen to align perfectly with the long-run profit-seeking goals of private sector companies. Earlier, Anna mentioned this paper, The Moral Machine, which is some really cool research. One of the lead authors on that, Ian Rahwan, has done a bunch of other cool stuff, including writing this paper called Society in the Loop. That's kind of a play on this term that I'm sure all the panelists are familiar with, and maybe everyone who's in attendance. The idea is like, you want to have systems that aren't totally autonomous. They have like a human in the loop. And the idea with society in the loop is like, what does it look like to build technology that enables some kind of digital social contract where, you have this stuff that's like being built and it's incredibly powerful. How can you consult not just with like one technocrat, let's say, or a CEO or a research scientist at an academic lab, but instead with like society writ large about like what the trade-offs are between these different things. And crowdsourcing stuff like Moral Machine is like one step in that direction, but ultimately we would of course need something much richer. I think we would need institutions that, to get back to this question of like what's the value function that you're optimizing for in the context of a company or in the context of an agent, like we need institutions that can like do a good job of getting like nuanced feedback from a large number of people and using that to guide things. And I think it's difficult to see that happening, under sort of like one person's private sector profit-seeking vision.
And I think inherent in what you're saying is that there's this idea that there's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma where maybe every individual wants to be fed that perfectly targeted piece of content, but en masse, that might not be good for society because it contributes to our fragmentation. And so the only way to solve that probably can't be solved by letting individuals just go consume Facebook the way they want to. It has to be solved by us having a social contract conversation about, okay, we all want to, that tempting candy over there of hyper-focused, hyper-targeted content recommendations, but we also need a global, a national discourse. And so how do we kind of temper some of those? Is that sort of what you're talking about, Teddy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that there is, I guess, like the stuff that, yes, actually, that's basically it. I feel like I've ranted too much, but yes, that's exactly the direction of stuff that I think is interesting. And I think it is cool to think about how machine learning can be a part of building those solutions as well.
I think that's super interesting. It's this idea of putting maybe some boundaries or some friction around the innate tendencies of these tools. Any solutions that any of the panelists find particularly optimistic for solving that problem, at least kind of on the societal level? Forget the sort of military stuff, but like on the domestic societal level.
Well, I think among the many problems we face, one of the chief ones is a crisis of legitimacy in so many of our institutions. I think that's brought on by a number of factors that many of them are related to the broader digital transition, right? The widespread availability of search and search has radically changed how we remember things, right? If a politician made a kind of a remark that was now diametric odds of what he's saying today, like 10 years ago. Or if that had happened 10 years ago, you probably wouldn't find his previous remarks, right? And now you can instantly. So there's, whether it's hypocrisy, whether it's leaking and releases of data sets, and maybe most importantly, questions about who decides what's fair, who decides what the algorithm tells you, right? This question of who decides, who sets those boundaries, has created unbelievable crises of legitimacy in almost every institution in our public life. I do think that increasing transparency around algorithmic choice and increasing transparency around like systems that are built to be auditable and transparent will help take some of the air out of those. I'm not a Bitcoiner per se, but I do think that some of the technologies underlying decentralized computing move us in the direction of auditability and transparency, and finding new tools to restore legitimacy and restore transparency around the question of who decides. Because one of the great things that is haunting our politics right now is the sense that we don't, someone is pulling the strings. That algorithm is personalized. That what you see is filtered. You don't know by whom, and you don't know by what criterion. And so I do think that technologies that build auditability and transparency will help restore legitimacy.
I like that. Does anyone else have thoughts? And also, if anyone from the audience has any questions, I probably should have said this earlier, but please throw them out. I have lots of questions that I could ask, but we have a whole Q&A panel, so feel free to pose questions. I'm happy to throw them out there. We had a little bit of a discussion before we got on about the concept of a digital identity, and I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts about this. So, Anna, John, Teddy.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the term digital identity is that it seems to imply a distinction between our digital identities and our analog identities, or like our real offline identities. And I guess I would say that the problem with the term digital identity is that now there's not a lot of daylight between digital identity and whatever non-digital identity is. Digital identity is identity, I think. I mean, I think, since at least the advent of the modern state, our identity has always had something to do with our paper trail, right? I mean, our identity has always had something to do with our name on legal documents or deeds or, government identity documents. It has something to do with your signature, right? Like you are where you sign. And, I think we historically have become legible to ourselves through our participation in bureaucratic and administrative institutions that try to give us a formally legible and fixed and distinct identity, which of course has always served the interest of some other force, right? Typically the state that needs to locate its citizens in order to tax them, conscript them, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in the 19th century, you could say that there was some kind of distinction between your identity as it was captured by this official paper trail and who you were as an individual playing various roles in your daily life and whatever your context was. And I would just say now, I think that's less true just because we spend so much more of our lives doing things digitally. So much more of what we do, to the extent that what we do is who we are, so much more of what we do is taking place online, and a much greater proportion of our attentional acts is happening in digital terms, and those are all recorded. And in some ways that means that our identities are more distinct actually, because it's pretty easy to forge a signature, but it's very hard to mimic someone's attentional patterns of attention, right? Which is what is being captured online. And in another sense, I think our identities are becoming much more homogenous and conformist and commodified, maybe, just because our so much more of our daily activities are being mediated through the commercial space of the internet. So I guess I'd say, to me, like the limit to the utility of the term digital identity is that it suggests that there's this implied contrast with this other thing that is not your digital identity. And I'm just not sure that that is actually a tenable idea anymore.
And in a few minutes we have left, I'll let Teddy go first because I think you have to jump soon. But do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. Just very briefly. Yeah. So Anna invoked this idea of legibility, which I think is like super relevant here. And I think that one can make a case that indeed, if I've understood like Anna's point correctly, a piece of it at least is that like perhaps these things are converging, and like the sort of like legible aspects of ourselves used to be like pretty crude, because like there was only so much that you could document in a way that, you know, the state or whatever authorities could collect. And increasingly that's becoming like much richer. And that brings with it a lot of potential, you know, for, let's say, in the context of democratic decision making, like, can we vote using systems that take much richer preferences from us than the incredibly compressed information that we like squeeze onto a ballot? I think that's like incredibly exciting. Obviously, there is like a million one ways that this could go wrong, and I think that like lots of, you know, dystopian fiction has been written premised on the idea that some actor, whether that is the state or a company, knows everything about you. Yeah, so I would agree that like I think that previously, like there were only some things that could be legible, and those things were incredibly impoverished representation of like the richness of ourselves and our desires and our beliefs. And that although that gap has by no means been totally closed, like maybe it is converging, and I think that has like pretty profound implications for how we think about our interaction with like political systems, among other aspects of society.
Yeah.
And now I do have to run, unfortunately.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And I don't want to end this conversation without giving John a chance to respond.
Well, I have a lot to say, but just briefly to synthesize and maybe push back on something that he just said after he's left, of course, is this. He described systems of identity that speak to the kind of richness of the human life, but I wonder whether it's actually gone in the opposite direction. In prior to the 20th century, or prior to the 21st century, maybe, there was such a gap between the kinds of identities that one could be assigned by social institutions or the state, that it created this space for the richness of everything that was uncapturable, right? Historians who study the rise of the individual as such date the individual as a concept to the time and place where this space between the richness of one's life and the kinds of roles and identities that a social institution could describe you, when that was created in early modern Europe. And I think that's closed again, right? I think precisely because we have digital systems which can capture and name and tag and catalog much sort of micro preferences, I think we additionally, we have come to identify as those preferences, right? We've come to incorporate a digital record of what had been the rich experience of human life as that experience. So we've actually left behind a great deal of what was rich and unique and individual about us in favor of a massive collection of these ascriptive micro identities. So I think we're at a very challenging transition in human civilization that has been brought on by this encounter.
Well, those are very, very interesting thoughts. And my one slightly intelligent comment is to say that I think some of these comments, particularly Anna's, remind me a lot of this great book by Scott called Seeing Like a State, which sort of really made me think deeply about like, wait, well, why do we need records about everyone? Oh, right, because the state needs to administer. And if you're sitting in, you know, Brasilia or Washington, D.C., and you need to administrate about some far off province, you need to have some uniformity. Otherwise, you can't possibly, you know, it's impossible for a human bureaucrat or not to sort of reason about the full complexity of millions and millions of individuals. And sort of thinking about that and kind of the reductionist nature, the necessary reductionist nature of that. And also like what that means for technology, right? Because in some sense, this is kind of what Facebook is trying to do with more richness than the government has or even is able to do, but just sort of saying like, hey, we need to reduce you into this like 100 length vector because that's kind of how we understand everything, and we can throw that into machine learning. But that's sort of, it seems to be a game. And I think it's an interesting question of like what that's, you know, what the modern version of that is like. But anyways, my own ramblings aside, thank you so much, everyone. I wanted to give a big round of applause to Anna, John, and Teddy for joining us. A big thank you to the Marshall Association for hosting this. A big thank you for all of our attendees for joining. And I hope we will be able to continue these conversations in person when COVID permits. All right, take care.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.